My name is Martin Empson, and I've got the slightly unusual task of simultaneously facilitating and chairing this meeting as well as speaking at it, and then introducing our other speakers. I would like to welcome everyone. I'd particularly like to welcome people who've arrived at Marxism today for the first day. We've been running for a few days now, but Saturday and Sunday are the biggest events. So welcome to everyone. What we're going to do today is we're here to launch the new book, System Change, Not Climate Change, a revolutionary response to environmental crisis. And as well as myself speaking, I edited the book and I've got a couple of chapters in that. I'm very pleased that we have two other speakers. We're all going to speak for about 10 minutes and there'll be plenty of time for discussion from the floor. I've got Ian Angus on my left. Ian is the editor of the online eco-socialist journal Climate and Capitalism. He will be familiar to many of you for his excellent books, Facing the Anthropocene and A Redder Shade of Green, are both, I would say, extremely important contributions to the socialist and Marxist tradition around the environmental movement, environmental activism, and an understanding of ecology. And on my right, I have Sarah Ensor. Sarah's a long-standing SWP member based in Manchester. She's a member of the PCS, and she's written a chapter in the book on the biodiversity crisis and on extinction. So before I come to that, I should also say that the book is a collection of essays. It's got contributions from a whole number of people, some of whom are in this room, and as part of the contribution, I'll be inviting those speakers to say a few words about their chapter and so on. But there will be other chance for other people to contribute as well. But by way of my own introduction, can you just time me for a thing? As I said, we're here to launch this book. The book very much has its origins in the movement itself. Your comrades will remember, I'm sure, the end of last year when the climate strikes, both internationally and here in Britain, hit the streets with school students in their tens and then their hundreds of thousands walking out on strike, following the call from Greta Thunberg. Later on, in 1st January and then April of this year, we saw in Britain the Extinction Rebellion strikes, which put tens of thousands of people on the streets, many of whom were prepared to be arrested, to engage in civil disobedience and to protest and demand radical action on climate change. And there's an Extinction Rebellion flag there, and well done for the comrades for bringing that. And the origins of this book, the title of this book, lie in those movements. Many years ago, I was part of organising around a climate summit that took place in Copenhagen in Denmark. And at the time, there was a System Change, Not Climate Change march that took place. And actually, it was a march of the left. It wasn't the whole movement. It felt very much like a slogan that came from the left, from the far left, from the socialists and the anarchists and so on. But actually now, if you go on any of those demonstrations, you see placards. I don't think I've seen a demonstration by school students that hasn't got a homemade cardboard placard somewhere that says system change, not climate change. So of course there are other slogans and other demands and other things that people are concerned about. But actually that slogan has touched a mood. It's one, I think, that socialists should be privileged and proud to engage with. It raises all sorts of questions, of course. What do you mean by system change? What is your different alternative, your different vision, and so on? Nonetheless, it's a good starting point for us. And I'm not surprised that people have started to protest in their tens, their hundreds of thousands, and I'm not surprised that people are engaging in even more radical demands themselves. You only have to look at what's happening in the world around us to realise that there's a lot to protest about, and there's a real urgency about protesting. The biodiversity crisis that Sarah will talk about is something that is terrifying all of us and actually motivating people. This is no longer a question for scientists writing in obscure scientific journals. This is an issue that scares tens, millions of people. It's an interesting fact, for instance, the Blue Planet 2 programme the BBC produced about life in water, which had a very famous episode at the end about the plastic crisis, the first episode was watched in Britain by 14 million people. The episodes, when they were broadcast and live streamed in China, were watched by up to 80 million people. So many people watched those programs that the Chinese internet speed slowed down as a result of that. That is an engagement by ordinary people in their millions with a concern about the environment and the planet. And there are other environmental issues that are coming up that are linked. Air pollution, for instance. There's a report, I come from Manchester, there's a report that says 152 roads in Manchester, none of which I should say are motorways, 152 roads have illegal levels of air pollution at the moment. Killer levels, is how they describe them. On every one of those roads, there are communities, there are schools, there are workplaces, there are hospitals, and so on. This is the state level of the crisis. And many people, I think, are saying, actually, we've known some of this stuff for quite a long time. Why has nothing been done about it? I'll let you into a secret. I actually own a piece of the Amazon rainforest. When I was about 7, my aunt bought me and my siblings an acre of rainforest. It was part of a campaign by various environmental NGOs to save the rainforest, and we all had to buy each other a piece. I was really pissed off because I wanted a book. But we got these. We have certificates that say you own an acre of the rainforest. God alone knows what's happened to it now. But actually, that sense of you could save the world then by buying an acre of rainforest for your nieces and your nephews. Actually, today that sounds farcical, doesn't it? The scale of the onslaught of environmental destruction and so on is so great at all. Since Bolsonaro was elected as president of Brazil at the end of the summer last year, the stripping back of the rainforest has now accelerated by 88%. And the companies that are driving that, the logging companies, the agricultural corporations, were the biggest contributor to Bolsonaro's election funding and campaigning. And, you know, my little acre of rainforest, if it's still there, faces a real threat, actually, not from ordinary people in Brazil, not even the indigenous people or so on, but it faces a threat from big multinationals that really want to do it. And then, of course, there's climate change. 12 years we have, 11 and a bit years now actually, they say, before we can no longer keep it to less than 2 degrees Celsius. That's a frightening statistic, and I think it's the one that's really dynamited the movement and driven people out onto the streets demanding real action. And part of the reason, I think, is because people say, look, you've known about this quite a long time. One of my favourite placards from the school student strikes, which I apologise in advance for the language, but it was written by a school student, not by me. 2 years you've been bitching about Brexit, they said, well, our planet is dying. It's a sense of actually why has nothing happened, but actually I think we can go a little bit further than that. One of the quotes that I've written in the book here is a scientist writing about the threat from global warming. The change global warming is thought to have come about mainly as a result of burning fossil fuels, he writes. The output of these and other carbon dioxide sources is outstripping the absorbing capacity of carbon dioxide sinks. If the surplus continues to increase at its present rate, CO2 in the atmosphere will reach levels of over 650 parts per million in the next 50 years. Scientists are now generally agree that the present build-up of CO2 in the atmosphere could, if it were to continue without restrictions, spell catastrophe for our planet within less than a century. Exactly what we must do about it remains in question until we have more exact knowledge, but time's not on our side. How can we avoid a dangerous bottleneck of atmospheric carbon dioxide? The obvious answer is by curbing the use of fossil fuels, but it's plainly an answer that today runs straight against the grain of real politics and economic habit. That was written by Robert Lamb, who was a conservation economist, wrote a very good book called The World Without Trees in 1979. So any of those politicians who say, we didn't know, we weren't sure of the science, Robert Lamb was right not to be entirely sure because the science wasn't quite there yet. But actually from 1979, people have been saying we need to curb our use of fossil fuels. And Robert Lamb's book wasn't obscure. It sold tens of millions of copies, tens of thousands of copies in Britain alone. It was a real blockbuster of an environmental book at a time when these things were not common. So I think one of the explanations, one of the questions the school students and the other activists are asking is why has it taken so long? And here I think we can get one explanation of why it's taking so long from a quote from Mohammed Barkindo. Anyone know who Mohammed Barkindo is? He's the Secretary General of OPEC, and he did an interesting speech yesterday, rather conveniently for this meeting, where he said that Greta Thunberg and the school student movement that she's unleashed is the greatest single threat to the existence of fossil fuels. Well, please thank Greta Thunberg and the school students, not me, for that one, because I think he's right, and that gives us an indication of why no action has happened. Because what has happened with the school student strikes, the Extinction Rebellion, all the other social movements, is it's actually put those fossil fuel corporations under the spotlight and has become quite a threat to the viability of them. So system change, not climate change, as I said, is a slogan that can mean many things to many people. And this book is an engagement with those debates. It's not one of those books where we want it to be saying this is the authoritative answer to all the questions. It's part of a debate and discussion inside and outside the movement about how we can fundamentally change the world and what that change will look like. It's also more than that, though. I think it's a book that argues that Marxism as an ideology has so much to offer these movements and people wanting to change the world and understanding our environmental crisis. I'm very pleased, for instance, that there are two chapters in it, one by the Japanese Marxist Kohei Sato, who has recently won the Isaac Deutscher Prize for his book Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, and a very important read. And he looks at the classical tradition of Marx and Engels and ecology, and also Ian Angus's chapter on the metabolic rift, which he will be speaking about later today, and I hope people will listen to that, is also a similar contribution. There are other chapters as well that are important. There's a great chapter from two of our Canadian comrades, Michelle Robideau and Caroline Egan, who hopefully will say a few words today about the movements that have brought together Indigenous people, trade unionists, socialists and environmentalists in North America to challenge tar sands and so on. Camilla Royale's written on the Anthropocene, a new scientific concept that I think comrades have to learn and understand. Ian Rappel has written about how they tried to solve it, how the capitalists tried to deal with climate change, biodiversity and so on, and how they come up with these bizarre schemes that make money while watching the world burn. And Amy Leather has written two good important chapters, one on plastic and plastic pollution, but I think also the development of fossil fuel capitalism and that. And finally, Suzanne Jeffrey has made a really important article in there that looks at the role of social movements in changing society and puts the emphasis on the working class and talks about how the environmental movement can link closely back to the environment, to the workers and to the trade unions to change things. So that's really enough from me. One thing I do want to finish on, though, is that I think this is a book that I hope comrades will buy. When I first joined Socialist Worker many years ago, we had a slogan: buy it, read it, sell it. And I really think that this is one of those books that you should buy yourself, you should read it, but you should sell it too. You should sell it in your local Extinction Rebellion groups, to climate strikers. You sell it to your workmates, because actually this is about generating an ideology, a radical revolutionary movement that can fight the system and bring about fundamental change. So thank you very much. I'm going to now hand over to Ian. As I said, Ian's come from Canada, and we'll be talking for 10 minutes himself. Okay.
Ooh. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I always love speaking at Marxism. I've had great times here in the past, and this is another wonderful one. You know, I actually have two reasons for being very pleased to be part of this book launch. I mean, the first and rather obvious one is that on a personal level, I'm honored that Martin chose to include my essay, The Discovery and Rediscovery of Metabolic Rift, in the book. If any of you read Climate and Capitalism, the website I edit, you'll know that I'm rather obsessed with that topic. And I've been writing a lot of essays on aspects of metabolic rift over the past couple of years. And this essay sums up some of the thoughts I've got on it since that time, and I hope you'll find it of interest. It's very clear to me that the theory of metabolic rift, which was first expressed by Marx and then subsequently developed and expanded by socialists in the 21st century, offers the best explanation and the best basis for action in the current crisis. But second, and much more important than my personal pleasure at getting my name in print, this book is a really important contribution to the most important struggle of our time, the fight to stop capitalism from destroying the planet our lives depend upon. You know, it's 170 years ago that Marx and Engels wrote that unless capitalism was eliminated, eventually the great productive forces that capitalism produced would turn into great destructive forces. And that's exactly what has happened. In my article in the book, I tried to summarize just some of the things that we now face. Global warming, superstorms, rising sea levels, toxic air and smog, ocean acidification and dead zones, species extinction, soil erosion, freshwater depletion, ozone destruction, indestructible plastics and chemical pollution, deforestation, expanding deserts, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, new diseases and plagues, and I gave up at that point. because I really couldn't fill the whole essay with it. But every day, we see more evidence that capitalism, which was once, a system that generated an unprecedented wave of creativity and a sense of liberation for people, has transformed itself into a force for destruction, decay, and death. There was a time, even at the time when I first got in the socialist movement, you could make a case that environmental destruction was serious, but no worse than any of capitalism's other crimes. That time is gone. Capitalism has driven us to a crisis point in the relationship between humanity and nature. If business continues as usual, business as usual is actually a BAU abbreviation, shows up in all kinds of scientific documents. If business continues as usual, major ecological collapse isn't just possible, but probable. And that will put civilization at risk. There's a fine article in the current International Socialist Journal by Alex Kalinikos, in which he quotes Jonathan Neal about talking about what collapse of civilization will be. And it isn't going to be retreating towards all of us living in nice little huts somewhere. What we see in terms of what collapse of civilization is rounding up children and putting them into concentration camps. That's the collapse of civilization. The collapse of civilization, we saw it several times in individual countries in the 20th century. The black boots walking down the street and millions of people getting executed as the ruling class attempts to establish firm control over a system that simply can't control itself. John Bellamy Foster made the point very clearly a few years ago. He wrote, "We have reached a turning point in the human relationship to the earth. All hope for the future of this relationship is now either revolutionary or false." All hope is revolutionary or false. In the second half of the 20th century, environmental destruction went from gradual to very fast, from short-term to long-term or even permanent, and from local to global. We now face a planetary emergency, an interlocked set of crises in the fundamental natural processes that have made Earth habitable for millions of years. What humanity faces in this century is not just deterioration in the conditions of life in one area or even one country. The metabolic rift, the split between humanity and the natural conditions of life, is now global. And there's now a very real possibility that it will throw all of humanity into a new dark age, and that our dreams of a better world will be replaced by unending nightmares. We have to adjust our thinking. We as socialists, we as revolutionaries, have to adjust our thinking and our actions to respond to that reality. In the past, and even today in many cases unfortunately, socialists have tended to treat environmental problems as just another stick to beat capitalism with, as another proof that capitalism must go, but not as an arena of class struggle to which we must be fully committed. In the 21st century, that approach is not just mistaken, it's suicidal. Today, fighting capitalist ecocide must be at the heart of our vision, our program, and our activity. Increasingly, the planetary emergency is directly affecting the lives of working people, farmers, indigenous communities, and all of the oppressed worldwide. As capitalism continues its relentless drive to expand no matter what damage it causes, we will see, and in fact we are already seeing, widespread resistance to those attacks. Many of these struggles that we will see will focus on narrow issues, and many of the participants will have illusions about what can be done within the system. That's inevitable. The worst mistake socialists could make in that such circumstances, and unfortunately it's a mistake that some socialists do make, is to stand on the sidelines because a given campaign isn't radical enough or because it doesn't fit somebody's preconceptions of what a movement ought to look like. Because the creativity of working people is enormous, and they will invent movements that we can't imagine. And XR is an example, I think. We need to remember Marx's great insight that people in large numbers don't change themselves and then change the world. They change themselves by changing the world. Rosa Luxemburg said, Class consciousness and organization aren't created simply by pamphlets and leaflets, but, quote, by the living political school, by the fight and in the fight. Lenin famously wrote that revolutionaries must not restrict themselves to a narrow economic understanding of class struggle. He called on socialists to be tribunes of the people, responding to every, quote, every manifestation of tyranny and oppression, no matter where it appears, no matter what stratum or class of the people. In our time, revolutionaries cannot be tribunes of the people unless we are tribunes of the environment. We must respond to the best of our ability to every manifestation of capitalist environmental destruction. This excellent collection of Marxist essays on the global environment crisis is, as I've said before, an important contribution to the process of building that movement that we need. It's an important and powerful contribution to the education of Greens and Reds everywhere, to building struggles against ecocide, and to educating the participants in those struggles. The online journal that I edit, Climate and Capitalism, has for some time featured a page called Essential Books on Marxism and Ecology. When I get back to Canada, System Change, Not Climate Change will be added to that list. Eco-socialists everywhere owe a debt of gratitude to Martin for editing it and to Bookmarks for publishing it. I encourage everyone here to buy it and read it. In fact, really you should buy two. Buy one and give one to a friend. It really is that good. Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce Sarah.
I'm going up there. About 2 minutes, yes, please. Sorry, comrades, I have to use the lectern or I can't see my notes. Oh, this is not the jolly part of the talk. If we carry on, as we are, business as usual, as Ian says, we are set to lose 1 million of the estimated 8.2 million species on Earth. And it's estimated because we have only identified about 1.8 million of those. And I'm going to use the example of insects, because, of course, insects with worms, microorganisms, and plant matter make up fertile soil. So if we destroy the insects, we are destroying the very basis of our food chain. And Puerto Rican rainforests have lost up to 98% of their insects in the last 40 years. And this is an area, I mean, the rainforests in Puerto Rico are an area that you would expect to have some of the highest densities of species on Earth. Mexican forests have lost up to 80% of their insects over the same period. And Germany's nature reserves have lost up to 75%. And of course, this means that thousands of species of birds, lizards, and mammals who either directly eat the insects or their food relies on the insects cannot breed successfully, so they disappear. And that is a direct relationship. So, Britain has lost 56% of its farmland birds. These are species like skylarks and partridges. And France has lost around 30% of their farmland birds since the 1980s. And of course, famously, we know all the problems coral reefs have had. Coral reefs form nurseries for 25% of the Earth's marine fish, and they are now threatened by acidification, warming water linked to climate change, and we are creating warming water. And acidification is creating ideal circumstances for diseases to grow. And as Martin said, thanks to the Blue Planet programme, most of us have seen the footage of whales, turtles and seabirds dying because they have eaten plastic and they are feeding their young plastic mistaken for food. Now, yes, these catastrophic levels of insect loss are linked to raising rising temperatures and pollution, but the biggest problem for them is the destruction of their habitats. And this has really been exacerbated by the global use now of glyphosate weed killers and neonicotinoid insecticides. Now, glyphosate and neonicotinoids were both developed in the 1980s as a response and to replace the previous generation of pesticides, including DDT, that turned out to be incredibly carcinogenic, as Rachel Carson wrote in her book Silent Spring. And so glyphosate and neonicotinoids have really been championed by, well, they were developed by Monsanto, that's recently been bought by Bayer, you know, these giant agrochemical industries. And the result of this, well, actually, I mean, originally environmental organisations felt that these were a solution to the problem as well. But they have, in some places, wiped out pollinators. They have wrecked ecosystems. They destroy bees' ability to find their way home, which obviously as a honeybee, if you can't find your way home, that's a death sentence. And this system, this is also what lies behind the fact that hundreds of thousands of farmers have been driven into debt and into suicide on every continent. And to understand why this is happening, we really need to understand that industrial farming and fishing is partly about producing food, but it's mainly about producing profit. And it's not, I really think we need to understand this is not because farmers don't care about their animals and their land. And we know this from even such a sort of mainstream example as farming today. There are constantly farmers being interviewed complaining about the way they cannot make a living out of what they want to do on farming. But there are also brilliant examples of farmers sinking their own money into innovative solutions to their pigs not getting enough clean water, or there aren't enough bumblebees, and these are the people who understand that their soil is losing its fertility. But under capitalism, each farm is a business that has to maximise its own profit against its competitors, who are, of course, other farmers. And this means that they have to maximise machinery size, and they have to break up their ecosystems. So grasslands are turned into great swathes of single crops, and rainforests are chopped down for soybeans and avocados. And this drive for profit in the industrial meat production is where we have got to the state of the feedlot system, where animals are penned inside or in a small space outside for the whole of their lives. So you take a cow, for instance. A cow is a herd animal, so it is a social animal that needs sunshine, lots of space outdoors to roam around. It needs fresh air. It needs lots of different plants to eat. It's very complex biology, turns into milk. And our feedlot systems are reducing these animals to milk and calf machines that are worth so much profit per square metre they take up. And of course, the result of this is that although the feedlot system is highly profitable, they also become centres of pollution, disease, antibiotic resistance, and animal misery. And of course, industrial fishing treats the oceans in the same ways. So, why don't we just stop? Why can't we just stop cutting down the rainforests, stop overfishing, and stop climate change? And of course, we've all heard the mainstream answers: selfish human nature, irresponsible corporations, meat eaters, and too many people. My particular favourite. And this situation makes no sense unless we understand that what links biodiversity crisis to industrial meat production, deforestation, overfishing, rising temperatures, and extreme weather events is capitalism's drive for profit. So, in effect, the destruction of biodiversity is an inevitable byproduct of processes that exalt the accumulation of profit above all other considerations. And this is why we are heading towards a world where large bits of it will not be habitable. And we are going to have to get rid of capitalism because the capitalist solutions to problems created by capitalism are completely inadequate, as we saw with glyphosate and neonicotinoids. And I just wanted to mention Ian Rappel's article in the book, where he demonstrates very well that you can't solve the crises created by capitalism by applying the theory and practice of capitalism. So natural capital and environmental services are doomed to fail. So, to finish, what we need to do is replace capitalism with socialism. It's that easy, comrades. And when we do this, rewilding and other forms of biodiversity conservation are more likely to succeed because they will be democratic and we will have a rational approach to our food production, our use of nature and natural resources, and we will not force other life forms to compete with capital in its profit motive. This is how we could repair our relationship with the planet, develop our ecological understanding, and rid ourselves of the muck of ages. And this is how we can shape a convivial, sustainable future. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you to both Ian and Sarah. Now's the chance. Is there someone from the team who's going to do the roving mic, please? Now's the chance for people to contribute.
This follows on from what the last speaker was just saying, because I'm also a member of a trade union, and last week tried to put through a motion with other comrades regarding climate change. We started from a point of supporting the school strikes, and went on with a list of environmental concerns and a call for change. We tried to make it quite clear that this wasn't putting people out of jobs, that this was about a transformation of society. We did not. It would have been a lot easier, I think, if we could just have said, you know, capitalism has to end. And I think there were people in the room who sort of know that capitalism has to end, the people who knew this can't go on. But we put out a list of points about housing and jobs and put it in context, but we also had a line in there about the end of fossil fuel extraction. And then came a problem that part of the jobs that we include is people working on oil rigs. And people just went, oh, okay, right, this is our jobs. You're speaking about our jobs here. And what I think people in the room felt, it wasn't an outright, these people are taking our jobs away. It was a kind of confusion. A lot of people ended up abstaining because people thought, yeah, we get it, we know, we're not silly, we can see what's coming. But what about our jobs in the short term? And we sort of faltered. So it's good to hear about the comrade from Unison about that can be overcome and taken forward.
Yeah, I actually was able to contribute to the book, and my chapter actually looks at how, in order to understand the situation we've ended up today, we really need to look at how capitalism is organised, and very specifically how the whole growth and development of capitalism is completely entwined with the growth and development of the fossil fuel industry. And really this is what has led to the situation today where fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas are completely locked into capitalism. Because actually, capitalism adopted fossil fuels on a massive scale during the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. Let's be clear, you want to call this a fossil economy, the birthplace was Britain. It was during the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s that an energy transition takes place. Essentially, there's a shift from using water power to using steam power generated from coal to power the early machines of the textile industry. This wasn't inevitable. To be honest, water power dominated in the early days of industrialisation. It was free. But in the end, steam power won out. And really, this was because actually the use of coal enabled capitalists better to able to exploit workers because it was mobile. You could take coal to where workers were in the growing cities, rather than having to take workers to where the water was in the rural areas, and then capitalists had to pay out for more infrastructure, but not enough workers, so those ones went on strike to replace them. It made more sense for them, this mobility of coal, and once one capitalist adopted it, all of them did. So by 1830, the majority of textile mills were using steam. So it means that coal became the energy basis of production, driving the Industrial Revolution forward, not only the machinery, but the transport like steam trains forward. And this whole fossil economy was really projected outwards across the globe through both economic competition, but also through actually colonialisation and imperialism, the steamships that were used to conquer new territories and things that previously had resisted. And this really drives out fossil fuels beyond Britain. And of course, the arrival of oil in the 1850s accelerates this. I also look at really, though, how this process is then accelerated in the post-war period after 1945. And this is something actually Ian has written about in other books quite a lot about this process. And really talks about how there's been a massive increase in emissions. People talk about the great acceleration of emissions after 1945, that this took place really because of what happened during the Second World War. It laid the basis for this to happen. Oil was very decisive in the war, but actually governments like the US ploughed in massive amounts of investment into, if you like, the oil-related industries, particularly... Sorry. 1 minute left, okay. They spent billions updating the petrochemical plants to make the things for the war effort. Afterwards, they sell them very cheaply to the companies that became the Monsantos and DuPonts, really locking in fossil fuel use, and actually the age of plastic laying the basis for it in that post-war period. And the point about this is to say that the world we live in today is actually the whole infrastructure of capitalism has been built on fossil fuel, first coal and then oil, and you'd have to write off these enormous investments, these sunken historic investments, if we were transitioned to renewables. And really, although there is opportunities for capitalism to try and move into new markets of renewables, actually it would be quite illogical for them to write off all these sunken investments. And I suppose the conclusion here really is that fossil fuels are not this overlay that you can just peel away from capitalism. They are completely embedded in every aspect of the system, and that really leads you to the conclusion you have to get rid of the system. What people are talking about, revolutionary change. Very importantly, this isn't an argument we're just going to wait for the revolution. Campaigning matters in all the ways people have talked about. Campaigning over fracking has actually stopped some of the further expansion of the fossil fuel infrastructure in Britain at the moment. But actually, it means that what John just talked about in terms of the 20th of September gives us a massive opportunity to take that movement forward, to join with the school students on the streets, walking out on strike, and to be honest, that is just the beginning of it. We want this movement to grow and continue and deepen to make real the title of the book, System Change, Not Climate Change.
There's a man in a black T-shirt just there.
I wanted to go back to the talking of the Extinction Rebellion. It was brilliant when they did the Waterloo Bridge sort of closure, the amount of days that they managed to keep that locked off, and the sort of atmosphere was very, very, very nice sort of atmosphere. What I also got from it as well is that from certain very, very middle class individuals who believe that we are non-blame, we are non-political as well. So I think the importance of being a socialist, obviously, through going through the regular activity, is putting our point of view forward of why it's important that we need to overthrow the system, which, let me say, had a few harsh arguments in that process, from reply back from people on the Extinction Rebellion. But I think it shows the power of such a movement that has already put enough pressure. It already shows that we need to put our little point in as well to push that movement extra further, so we can put even more pressure on the governments and the councils. And I can say it even more as a gardener myself, who recently have literally lost a lot of food, and food growth just dying too quickly because of the heat, the lack of rain last year. And then literally through the month, like loads and loads of rain and the lack of bees as well. So I'm going to wrap up now, but yeah, so that's the importance of putting the feedback on that.
Hi, yeah, we're talking about fossil fuels and we're saying about that, the stuff that Exile's done is great, it's raised awareness, it's got thousands of people there. The school strikes, support them. STEM will strike, absolutely. But there's been people living on the fracking, fighting the fracking for years, living on camps. There's, you get local communities built up, but fossil fuels, the fracking now, 60% of this country, England, is down for fracking. It's got licences. There could be licences near you. If you're not down for a licence to be fracked, it could be acidisation that's going on up in Yorkshire. Yeah, you've got coal bed methane, but even not. We're down in Dorking and Newdigate, Hull Hill, they're fracking. The wastewater went to Newdigate. There's been massive earthquakes down there. This contaminates the water. It kills the air. And you just, you cannot understand how much how insane it is. You've got police riding on rigs to get the rigs in. Yeah, you've got people getting thrown into hedges. You've got people getting brutalised because there's not enough people there. 100 people a day at these sites will close this lot down. Will close it down. They can't police it. They bring in the police from all other, like they did in the miners' strike when they shipped in all the police. This is what they're doing at the fracking sites. This is what they're doing. We need to occupy these lands before. If you know there's a pedal licence near you, join your local anti-fracking group. Have a look. See what you can do. Occupy the land before the frackers get on there. This is... There's a community comes out of this that cuts across class. Because it doesn't matter whether you're affected... Your house prices people get affected by, so they join because of that. Or they go because they just don't... They want to look after their kids. I'm not saying one or the other, but... It cuts across class is what I'm saying. It cuts across class and you will get a community out of that. There's people up there who live in massive houses up on the fire. We come from Preston New Road. We've been up there for time now. And then people have been from Barton Moss, Balcombe, Davy Hume, Upton, you name it. Everyone, we're known in the press as a travelling circus. But actually the frackers are a travelling circus because they've got 100% failure rate. 100% failure rate. And they're going to contaminate your water. They will. They don't care. And they will go to any length. So we need you there. We need Extinction Rebellion lot to come and we want the thousands of people at the fracking sites so we don't keep getting battered and thrown about and treated like crap by the police.
Michelle, who's contributed to the book as well.
Thanks. And Carol and I both contributed to the book, and the topic of our chapter was on Canada's tar sands, Indigenous sovereignty, and a just transition for workers. And a lot has happened since we wrote that article. It's moving at an incredibly fast pace, and I think that's the urgency that I sense in this meeting is perfectly appropriate. Canada is 200 years behind its targets for 2030. That's the current state of things. And just a couple of weeks ago, not even two weeks ago, the Liberal government did two things back to back. They declared a climate emergency, and they said that bold action was needed. And the next day, they approved the Trans Mountain tar sands pipeline, the expansion of the pipeline. And I think, obviously, from the reaction, people know what that is. The response from Indigenous people in British Columbia, which is on the route of this pipeline, was immediate. The Grand Chief of the BC Union of Indian Chiefs, Stuart Phillips, said that the land is dying, the fish are dying, the people are hurting, and this is not the time for a reckless policy such as this. And of course, this was on the eve of the National Indigenous Day in Canada, at the time when there's just been a report released on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and all of these, fancy words from the government saying that yes, we care about Indigenous people, but they don't care about free, prior, and informed consent. When Indigenous people say we do not want this crossing our land, the government ignores it. So that is in a snapshot. That is the situation in Canada. Canada is heating 2 times as fast as the rest of the world. And in the north of Canada, it's even worse. And it means that Indigenous people are losing completely the basis for their survival, for their existence. The ice flows, all of the stuff that we know is disappearing. It's a massive crisis. At the same time, though, in the snapshot, is the Green New Deal has taken off. in Canada at a pace that is absolutely astounding. There are 300 town halls that have been planned. 200 of them have happened already. It is a bottom-up process of the Pact for a Green New Deal. Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis have been part of a tour across the country where they're saying this is not a climate policy. This is a massive state intervention to tackle multiple crises, to tackle the burning need for social and economic equity in society, to put justice at the heart of a plan to transform society, to tackle this emergency, climate emergency, and to tackle poverty and inequality and racism. And critically, to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which means free, prior, and informed consent by Indigenous people for any of these mega projects. And that thing is taking off, and it's pushed the NDP, the New Democratic Party, to take up this issue, but it's a far too timid, far too meek interpretation of the Green New Deal that we need, and it's lowering people's horizons, and it's a federal election year, and the right is doubling down on pitting jobs and the environment. The Liberals' answer is a disaster, clearly. So the clock is ticking on a movement for an alternative vision of what we need. And at the same time, the climate strike is there. 150,000 students took part in Quebec in the student strike on March 15th at the call of Greta Thunberg. It was a fantastic development. It's called The Planet Invites Itself to the University. And massively, people, it's incredible. If you see the footage of that demonstration, they're going to be there on September 27th. They're going to be there. We have September 27th, not the 20th, but we will be there in the global strike. And just want to say one thing. The boldness of the XR mobilizations, the Fridays for Future, a young woman, maybe 20 years old, contacted our Trades and Labour Council in Toronto and said, will you declare a strike for September 27th? That's the boldness that's there. We have to match that boldness by saying, yes, we will be there by starting the discussion that the brother talked about in unison. That is what we need to do everywhere across the world.
The woman up there in the red, Judy Peasants.
Hi, yeah, I'm a Unison steward and a member of York XR and the SWP. I'm really excited about taking the book into XR meetings and trade union meetings as it makes the connection that needs to be made between the movements. We had an XR event in York last week called Demand a Future. It was a people's assembly. 350 people sat down and debated how to make York carbon neutral by 2030. And that's what the council have signed up to in their emergency declaration. It was a really open debate with school strikers, councillors, trade unionists, students all taking part and coming up with ideas about how this would work. And the mandate produced included pedestrianising the city, free public transport, signing up to the 1 million climate jobs. A year earlier, these demands would have seemed unrealistic, and you couldn't have had 350 people in the library on a Friday night debating what to do about climate change. And this is the difference that the strikers and XR have made. I was at Unison Conference, and there was a lot of emphasis on the desperate need for young activists in the trade union movement, and it was easy to then make the connection between the school strikers, XR, and the next generation of trade unionists. There needs to be such a connection if either are to succeed. I mean, taking part in the occupation on the streets of London at least Easter was truly inspiring, but it's not enough. Without workers at the forefront of the movement, capitalism can't be overthrown, and the planet can't be saved. I mean, as communities and outreach coordinator for XR, my role is to make the link between the environmental campaigns and the trade unions. And we have an organising meeting coming up in York for the September the 20th, and it was easy in XR to make the need for this clear. A new XR member came up to me who was a social care worker and also in Unison, and she said that she was glad the organising meeting was happening as she was worried about walking out alone. I think since the event has gone up on Facebook, it's clear that other activists see the need to organise. It's been shared by the President of Trades Council and lots of Labour Party activists as well. I mean, what's happening to the planet is terrifying, and the recent survey put out by the National Grid points to the fact that climate anxiety is rising because people feel there's a lack of urgency in tackling the climate crisis. But working alongside people in XR who are totally determined to fight for our existence, come what may, and watching young people walk out in the classrooms has given me a real optimism that if we join this with the trade union movement, we have a chance. I mean, Greta Thunberg's call for adults to join the fight has lain down the gauntlet, and we need to rise to the challenge.
Down the blue shirt. Hugh, that's you, yeah.
It's, in a way, following on from the last contribution. I think if you think about around 100 years ago and the wave of uprisings and revolutions from Russia to Germany, Italy, and across Europe and the globe, you cannot understand that movement without reference to the First World War. I think it's safe to say without the First World War, it is unlikely that movement would have erupted in the way it did. It seems to me that today, climate change is the war. That what we're facing is of devastation to people's lives on such a scale that actually radical measures, radical action, radical solutions, revolutionary solutions can have a chance of becoming the common sense. Like the last speaker, I think you see the demand for free public transport, which a few years ago would have been, you know, that's nice, that will make it cheaper, is now not just about economic benefits for working people, but actually as a radical anti-privatisation demand about the way in which cities are structured and people's lives are run. And I think you can do that right across the board. And I think one of the things we have to do is when they in Honda in Swindon, that they threaten to shut that place down, or Ford's in Bridgend in South Wales. We don't castigate those workers who work in the car industry. We say you have fantastic skills. You should be putting those skills to the solutions of society and not to the problem. And you know the reality is that actually saving the environment is about saving jobs and is about building a much better world. And I think those radical solutions. I'll end on this. You see, I think in India, in the north of India, you have got a heat wave of terrible proportions. In Mumbai, you have floods, and in Chennai in the south, you have a city running out of water, where the private water companies are up in the price so people cannot afford to get the water. A demand that says any company that increases water prices when people are desperate for water should be taken away from those private companies, nationalised, and actually the water distributed to the mass of the population.
Paul, can you give it to Sarah? Anna.
Hiya. I'm a journalist on Socialist Worker. My name's Sarah Bates, and I should say that we do cover this book in Socialist Worker this week on pages 14 and 15, just so everyone can turn to their copy after the meeting. I'm really glad the book has come out. I think it's going to be a really vital tool to take into our Extinction Rebellion groups, the school strikes, anti-fracking groups, trade union meetings, and everything else. And I'm actually really glad that it's called System Change, not Climate Change, because I've reported on the climate school strikes, and that is kind of the unofficial slogan of a lot of it. It is an amazing feeling to be in central London and there's 15,000 school students kind of spontaneously chanting that. And I think one of the kind of the tragedies of the school climate strikes actually is the fact that they take place during the week. Most people actually don't get the opportunity to experience that. They don't get to experience the kind of the radical politics and just the fury from the school strikers. And actually, I think you underestimate these people at your peril, because I've been part of the Extinction Rebellion International Rebellion in London in April, and I actually disagree with the comrade who kind of characterised it as middle class. That's actually not my experience, and I think actually you can fall into being quite dismissive of these people actually, because to be a member of Extinction Rebellion, you need to believe that it's possible to decarbonise Britain by 2025, which I think is a radical demand, and. On the school students, these are a group of people who think we have 12 years left. And Ian talked very powerfully about how we will lose the ability to dream of a better world. But this is a group of people who think they are going to lose their entire future. And unless workers join them, unless adults join them, it gets pulled as a question of intergenerational politics. I was told on the last school student strike that actually it was adults who had spent their whole lives flying around the world, eating meat and buying plastic, and they had stolen their future from them. Actually, this can pull in quite skewed ways. A colleague of mine, a journalist, was told, it's going to affect people like me. It's not going to affect people like you. It was his 29th birthday. He's definitely going to be affected, by climate change. He was quite upset by that, actually. So I think the best way we can cut through this kind of intergenerational thing is to join them. It's not to support them, it's to join them in their fight, because if we leave them to fight alone, they will lose.
I really wanted to salute actually my comrades from the anti-fracking fight who spoke so enthusiastically and inspiringly from the front. They've been, I don't know if people know what's been happening at Preston New Road, but these people have been down there on the road in front of that fracking site, day in, day out, being pushed around by the police, being harassed, being followed, having the full repression of the state and the private company that is trying to frack brought down upon their heads. And she's quite right when she says that fracking affects that entire community. It's an entire community's worth of air, and it's an entire community's worth of water. But it also affects one class more than it affects another. And I think we have to be quite clear that the people who can't move away from a fracking site, who can't mitigate the effects of climate change in general, is the working class, is our class. And one of the things that community down at PNR has also done very well is to involve the trade union movement in their fight, in their solidarity days, and in getting resolutions passed through trade union branches and so on. And in that sense, actually, before the school strikes and before the youth climate movement, before XR, the anti-fracking community in this country was paving the way for a class analysis, actually, of the crisis that we're facing. But I just wanted also to try and tie this in, probably inelegantly, back to the book, because you see, in order to have those arguments in the fights that we're involved with, that there are subtleties and nuances about humanity's relationship with the environment, which I had not really taken on board until I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of a proof of the book. And you know, the question of our relationship with the rest of nature, are we something separate? Are we inherently destructive? Or is our relationship with nature determined by the class structure that we're part of? If you want the subtlety, if you want to come away feeling like Sarah Ensor said, that we can have a convivial Anthropocene, actually, then I think you need to read that book.
There's two people down here. The guy in the pink shirt, purple shirt. Can't really tell my glass.
Yeah, I'm John Parrington from I teach science at Oxford University. Yeah, I wanted to make 2 points. One, I think, was to really echo the fact the speakers were saying we can't be alarmist enough about the real danger of climate change. Because sometimes the image you get is that climate change is a bit like a slowly filling bath. You know, it's slowly rising the level. Any one point you'd be able to just turn off that tap and stop it. Now, I think there's two problems with that. One is that first, this turning off isn't happening. Actually, things are getting, the CO2 levels are actually getting worse, not the rise is getting worse, not better. And secondly, it ignores a principle in science called positive feedback, which is that sometimes a situation can take on a life of its own. And we're really starting to see that possibility in what's happening in Antarctica and in the Arctic and Antarctica, in the sense that the rise in the temperature there is potentially going to release massive levels of methane, which is also an incredibly important greenhouse gas, and that could then set off a cycle that will mean things that will just get worse and worse and worse. And so the analogy of the bath filling up is more like if the tap breaks and the whole bath then starts to, you can't stop it. The other point I wanted to make was this thing about, to echo what other people have said about the possibilities for real resistance, even if, things do get so catastrophic because there's a collapse in agriculture, that kind of thing. Because there was one quote mentioned by Jonathan Neal, this idea that in a breakdown in civilization due to climate change, we might see, tanks on the street, people being put in concentration camps. And I think that's possibly one possibility, but I think it would be pessimistic to think that is the only scenario, because if you look back in history, actually when there have been catastrophes in civilization in the past, actually there's nearly always been massive struggle as well. An example is the Black Death of the Middle Ages, when 50 to 60% of people died because of that. And that was obviously a catastrophic thing, but it gave rise only a couple of decades later to the Peasants Revolt. Now, we can learn a lot from the Peasants Revolt. One is that ordinary people have a massive power to really change things. They challenge the whole fuel system, but also the need not to compromise, because actually what happened was they were betrayed by the ruling class. Wat Tyler was killed here in Mile End, where we're speaking at the moment, and although they got rid of serfdom, it could have gone in even further. So I think it shows the stakes are so high, but also the potential, and that's why workers' power is central to that, and why my union, the UCU, have voted to back the climate strike on the 20th of September.
John Sinner next to him.
Yes. Sorry, is that clear? Yeah. So it's people have pointed out, actually it's not climate change we're talking about. It's an impending and looming climate catastrophe is what we're discussing. And also, as the science, as people have made it clear, that as we're learning very quickly how bad things are, also things are changing politically. I mean, last year, nobody knew who Greta Thunberg was. Nobody knew who XR was. If I had been been at this meeting last year and told you that 15 and 16-year-olds will be addressing trade unionists and arguing, making the case for a strike, you'd have been saying, "What have you been smoking?" That's what you'd have been saying. It's incredible the way things can change so quickly. I've been involved in the climate just movement, what we call the climate justice movement, since 2004. We organised the first global demonstrations before Facebook was around. You know, we've got the photos to prove it, if you don't believe me. But this movement is different from all the other climate movements that have come before. It is much more a grassroots movement. It's coming from the bottom up. The movements, the way that climate politics existed 10 years ago was led by NGOs. It was top down. It was bureaucratic. It was based on this Enlightenment idea that you just need to present a rational argument to our rulers and they will come to their senses and make the right decisions. But we as socialists understand that is not how change happens. Change happens through political struggle. And what I mean by political struggle is the clash of opposing forces. And this is what we're seeing. And it's because of Greta Thunberg. I will be marching out of my office, hopefully with my colleagues, in the City of London on the 20th of September. And she's made that possible. We owe her an enormous debt, those who have been working on this for the past decade.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to ask our two speakers to come back for 2 or 3 minutes each to respond to the stuff from the floor. So, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm a PCS union rep in my workplace. And we support the climate strike of the 20th September, and I'm on the Northwest region, which has declared a climate crisis. And all of this is great, and it means absolutely nothing unless we actually make this concrete in workplaces. So, I mean, the first thing, I've been talking about this with my colleagues last week, and we are going to invite a climate striker into our next branch meeting at the end of this month, and we have to make an argument about this. Now, I think, personally, that I am often one of the most conservative people in the room in a members' meeting, because I'm constantly thinking about what management... I mean, I tried to invite an XR speaker in, and management went crazy at me, for various reasons. And so I absolutely must not judge this by my initial reactions, because my initial reaction is, we could have a lunchtime thing where we do a photo opportunity and, you know, blah, 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 and we tweet about it, and it's... You know, oh God, you know, is that really the limit of what's possible here? And John's point that to start talking about this wouldn't be legal or this wouldn't be lawful is just so missing the point, and it is such an abdication of responsibility. And the average civil servant now is under 30, and you know, my members are way ahead of me in this, and so, you know, I will have to be one of the people fighting my own conservatism in this. But I think the first thing to do is get a climate striker into your workplace and make sure, you, of course, that you go to your XR meetings. I'm a, you know, trade union activist with XR as well, and the possibilities here are endless.
Wow. I do come from Canada, where the organized labor movement is far weaker than it is here. So much of what you're saying is really inspiring, I'm sure, to Carmen's in the front who wrote for the book as well. But we are seeing activity there. And that's one of the things I think is important about this book and about the discussion we've had here, is that what we see when Marxists start to think about this kind of movement and deal with it, what we bring to it is a class struggle view of how you change society and how you change the world. And bringing working people into the struggle is critical to that. There's a tendency, in fact, a very strong tendency among Greens to basically write off workers as enemies. To the workers who work on the oil rigs, the workers who work on the tar sands are treated as enemies rather than potentially our most powerful allies, the ones that could actually turn the taps off. And that's a thing that I think that the left, the socialists, can bring to the movement, is that understanding. And we can also bring real experiences to it. I'm old enough to have spent a great deal of time in the anti-Vietnam War movement. And the key to the success of that in the United States was not, as the right wing would, hippies with flowers. It was when organized socialists started organizing soldiers. And it was when members of the U.S. military, very few of whom were members of organized organizations, started striking literally in Vietnam, frequently with hand grenades for their officers. But the point was, it was the people that many of the pacifists viewed as simply enemies who actually made the major force in bringing that war to an end. Now, is that possible in our time? Well, just a week ago, this is not a climate issue, but it's an interesting point to those who think that working people will only vote with their wallets. They will think only in terms of their income and thus will favor whatever the bosses propose. Working people are not just bodies on the production line. They are also humans. They are also people with children. They are also people whose grandchildren are going to have to live through this world, and they're very aware of it. Well, what happened, this is, I say, not a climate issue, but an interesting one. In the United States, the largest single vendor of furniture, household furniture, is a company called Wayfair.com. And they sell on enormous levels of, everything, beds, all the rest of it. Well, Wayfair.com is the supplier of furniture to Donald Trump's concentration camps. And the workers at Wayfair first took up a petition to demand that the company stop selling furniture to Donald Trump and the concentration camps. And when the company said no to a petition that had been signed by almost every single worker, they went on strike for a day. And that was literally workers voting against their economic interests for their interests as humans, as people who have to live in this world. And that is a force that we have to mobilize. One of the strengths of this book is that underlying all of the articles is the view that the climate crisis and the environmental crisis more generally is not an abstraction. It is a function of a system of class oppression, and the only way it can be stopped is by the victims of that oppression getting rid of it. Thank you.